can't do this just yet.
I've won! What, does that mean I win the gauntlet?
Intervention, Nomad.
Wait, does I win? Did I actually win? Is this the best timeline?
The toy refuses.
Ah yes, bleeding, the damaging ailment that time forgot. Okay, that's probably a little bit dramatic, but really, bleed builds are in a very bad spot right now. The only decent bleed builds are bleed bow setups, and even these require a very good bow to deal even remotely competitive levels of damage. But this video isn't really about bleed bow, no, this video is really about melee bleed builds. Because melee in general is not faring very well right now. And at the very bottom of the list of melee builds, we have bleeding. Now the fall of melee bleed builds can be traced back to a few significant changes that were made in Path of Exile's 3.14 patch, Ultimatum League, and patch 3.15 Expedition League. Prior to these leagues, the most popular melee bleed builds were Earthquake, typically played with a one-handed axe and a shield on Gladiator, or a two-handed axe on Juggernaut, or the classic Lacerate Gladiator build. These builds made use of a weapon modifier to massively boost damage. This was the Elder Influence modifier, which granted 60% chance for bleeds to deal 100% more damage. However, in 3.14, this modifier was replaced with an inferior damage modifier which grants damage over time multiplier for bleeding. At the highest tier, this one rolls up to 59%, which is significantly weaker than the previous mod on most builds since it stacks additively with all of your other sources of damage over time multiplier. This was a big blow to melee bleed builds, and Lacerate builds have never really recovered from this change. The build is still a fast mapper thanks to the Gladiator's bleed explosions, but the damage is really lacking. However, there was another melee bleed build which was outperforming Lacerate at the time, and this was Earthquake. The reason that Earthquake was doing so well was because of Seismic Cry. Now this warcry that was introduced in patch 3.11 exerted slam attacks to grant them a lot more damage, and I do mean a lot more damage. In its original implementation, Seismic Cry granted 30% more damage as a baseline, with a further 30% more damage per previously exerted attack. The warcry exerted 4 attacks, and when combined with the extra exert on the passive skill tree, this warcry alone would grant 150% more damage on the 5th exerted attack. Because bleed has a decently long duration, attacks could be cancel casted to make sure you consistently hit the 5th exerted attack for the maximum damage boost, which was very useful on bosses. However, in the same patch that the Elder Bleed modifier was replaced, Seismic Cry was also nerfed, bringing the damage per exert down to 20% more. These two changes combined were a massive hit to slam-based bleed builds, but the biggest change was still to come, because in patch 3.15, just one league later, the damage modifier on Seismic Cry was removed completely, only being replaced with some area of effect. To make things worse, pretty much every support gem lost 10 to 20% more damage in one of the biggest nerf patches in Path of Exile's history. Now I'm sure you're expecting the rest of the changes to bleed builds in the time since then, right? It's been 7 leagues since 3.15 after all. But no, melee bleed hasn't received any significant changes in all of this time. It really does feel like the ailment that GGG forgot about. But I'm hopeful for changes in the near future for a few reasons. Firstly, we've been getting some Ascendancy reworks in recent leagues, and no Ascendancy is more deserving of changes than Gladiator. So with a bit of luck, that one will be looked at soon. But also, with all of the talk about the state of melee every league, I feel that melee changes will come around sooner rather than later, as I feel like every league Q&A with Ziggy D interviewing Chris, he asks the same question, simply melee ? I do get the impression that GGG want to overhaul melee to fix it, but realistically the changes they should be making in the meantime is buffs to the damage that these builds deal so that they are at least playable. So how can they go about that? As I've mentioned already, I think Ascendancy Reworks can go a long way to improving bleed and melee builds in general. This will likely require more targeted changes on Gladiator, and if you'd like to check out my ideas for some changes to Gladiator, I did a video on the topic a while back which you can find here. But one of my most wanted concepts for bleed is the ability to inflict bleeding using all damage types, not just physical damage. This will work similarly to the pneumatic dagger from Heist, which allows all damage from the dagger to inflict poison. To avoid confusion here, this wouldn't mean that you'd be able to inflict bleeding with spells, since all of the chance to bleed modifiers in the game only apply to attacks. But it would open up avenues to explore for weapon crafting and weapon choices in general, where you can use elemental and chaos damage to inflict bleeding as well. But even non-bleed specific melee ascendancy changes can be a big improvement too, like the Berserker, which could also do with some updates. More options is always better after all. Speaking of more options, the passive tree needs a lot more options for bleeding. There are just 2 bleed mastery clusters on the entire passive tree, while Poison has 4 clusters and Ignite has 6 or more if you include all of the Fire Dot multi-clusters too. An extra cluster or 2 providing more utility to bleed, similar to the new Attack Ignite clusters which were added in the Triad of the Ancestors League, wouldn't go amiss here, to provide access to some new mechanics. For example, the new Attack Ignite notable Concussive Force, which grants more damage to ignites for hits which stun enemies. Something like this for bleeding would be great. On the topic of utility, one of the most ridiculous things with bleed is the mechanic of the ailment itself. Bleeding deals damage over time based on the base damage of the hit which inflicted the ailment, but it deals much more damage when the target is moving. There's a way to force a target to count as moving, using the effect that is inflicted with Ensnaring Arrow. But for some reason unknown to everyone, this effect is exclusive to Ensnaring Arrow, and that means as a melee build you need to weapon swap to a bow to use Ensnaring Arrow to force a target to count as moving so that you deal a lot more damage. Seriously, just give us a melee support gem that applies this effect, give us a Warcry that applies this effect on exerted attacks, give us a passive tree notable that applies this effect. We need more utility that's readily accessible for melee builds. Weapon swapping to a bow for this reason really shouldn't be a thing. And speaking of the bleed mechanic, the calculation for the damage dealt by the bleeding ailment probably needs an update. The Ignite calculation got updated in 3.16 to deal 150% more damage overall. Bleeding currently deals 70% of base damage per second over 5 seconds, which increases to 210% of base damage if the target is moving. Ideally, the calculation would be fine if we had more access to the effect granted by Ensnaring Arrow, but without that, I'd like to see more damage when the target isn't moving, whilst leaving the moving component as is, so that you're less reliant on forcing the target to be moving to deal meaningful damage. For the record, I do really enjoy the bleeding mechanic, as it's a lot more interesting than Ignite or Poison, but we just need more tools to make it work. What do you think about the current state of bleeding in Path of Exile? Let me know in the comment section below. And with a bit of luck, we'll be getting the announcement of the announcement for 3.23 within the next few days. Are you guys enjoying the end of league events? Personally, I dabbled in the Krangled event a little bit, but I quit quite early on, wasn't enjoying it too much. But I played a decent amount of the Blast from the Past event, and I'll probably drop into the Shifting Stones event and see how I get on. But I'm eager to get some news for 3.23. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.